my son Ernie to come, and I said, as long as you don't mind interviewing me, you can ask me anything. And I said, I think I can answer it. So that's what he did.
So StoryCorps is a very simple idea. You make an appointment and you bring anyone you want to honor by listening to their story. It could be your grandmother or a friend or your bus driver, anyone who you want to bring to this booth. You bring them to the booth and you're met by a trained facilitator who brings you inside and you close the door and you're in this kind of sacred space. The lights are low, and for 40 minutes you look your grandmother, say, in the eyes and you listen and you talk.
Back in Mississippi, I couldn't hardly have been no more than probably about 3.
That's an early memory.
That's an early memory. I got a few. And there was 2, 3, about 4 of us there then. And at
the end of 40 minutes, 2 CDs have been burned. One goes home with you, the other stays with us, and goes to the Library of Congress. So your great-great-great-great-great-grandkids can someday get to know your grandmother through her voice and story. It's this very simple idea that has caught on pretty rapidly over the last 7 years, and I think that interview experience is so important to people because it reminds them that they matter and won't be forgotten. And it's really, people think of it as 40 minutes to kind of leave a legacy. They know that this will be the way that their descendants get to know them, so it becomes a really profound experience for people.
We talked about a lot of things, and I said to my son, perhaps I talked too much, really. But talked about everything. Some of my happiest moments. Of course, he hit religion, that I believe in after death, you know, God, miracles. And of course, he, being my son, you know, you got a birthday coming up. So he says, is there anything you like to do or to places you like to go for that celebration? I told him, you know, no. I said, as long as I'm with my family, you know, I'm happy. So it actually was a lot of things, wonderful things, and it was actually spontaneous.
I was a public radio documentary producer for many years, but it's really, I mean, every experience I ever had in my life kind of led to this thing. When I was a little kid, when I was 12 or 13 years old, I interviewed my grandparents with a tape recorder that I had around the house, a cassette recorder. And that whole generation, I had these like wild, crazy grandmother and her crazy sisters, and they were amazing people, and the whole generation died off. And when I was in my early 20s, I went looking for that tape and couldn't find it. And still to this day, 25 years later, you know, when I go to my parents' house, I look for the tape. And part of what I wanted to do with StoryCorps was to make sure that nobody made that dumb mistake that I did of losing that tape. So when you do StoryCorps, you know that this is going to be in the Library of Congress and it's going to be safe forever. Again, such a simple idea. But you know what I think StoryCorps does, there's 2 sides to it. One is this experience, and we've done about 35,000 interviews with about 70,000 people in all kinds of different facilities, including these mobile booths. There's also access to the stories, which are broadcast on NPR, and now we're starting to do animation, and we do these books and so forth.
Miss Devine was a wiry lady. She wore summer dresses, she had a bandana and a straw hat, and she was the only person I knew that had more power than my grandmother.
She wasn't a mean person, she was stern.
When you hear a voice on NPR, or you see one of these cartoons, or read something in a book, almost by definition it's going to be someone very different than you are. But I think that when you hear these stories, just for an instant, you're likely to walk in the footsteps of someone who you may have thought was very different than you, and recognize a little bit of yourself in that person. And that act, I think, of recognizing our shared humanity and how much more we share in common than divides us is important, especially during these days of, you know, kind of incredible divisiveness in this country.
What kinds of jobs did you have since first arriving in the country?
We were gardeners, and we were cleaning offices.
I remember the offices.
You remember that? We had the night shift cleaning. That's why, you know, we had to take you and your brother. I didn't have a babysitter.
I have memories of running into everyone's office and eating candy from their candy dishes. I remember being with my brother in our pajamas with the little plastic feet. And I also remember you would always buy us a cup of noodle from the vending machine, right? Like a snack, and then put us to bed on people's office couches. And then you'd carry us to the car when you guys were done cleaning the offices. I remember that.
I had heard about StoryCorps, I think like a lot of people do, just on National Public Radio. I'd heard the clips before, but It wasn't until I heard this one really phenomenal conversation, and it was really a simple kind of conversation between a mother and her daughter, just talking. The daughter was essentially just thanking her mother for her work and for her sacrifices. And it ended up really resonating with me, and I sent it on to my sisters, and it ended up kind of making us have a similar conversation with my mother. I think that was my first experience feeling kind of like the power of that conversation in a family.
If you could do everything again, would you raise me differently?
I would dedicate more time, I guess. You know, I was so busy going to school too that I guess I neglected you a little bit.
No, for me, watching you go to school with 2 kids and trying to make ends meet, that was the biggest inspiration for me to finish college. I thought there's nothing that could stand in my way that didn't stand in yours more.
To watch the relationships that people have who come in, I think that's the really inspiring part of the job. I mean, we get to travel, we get to meet amazing people, but I think to be able to sit in is a huge honor.
When you were saying, David, when you were interviewing me, you were basically tracking, as my friend and someone who's known me well for 8 years, sort of tracking my little moments of births, my little births to self along, because you immediately asked me about my first marriage and then a birth of child and artistic decisions, identity, and then tracking to why I came to Trenton, issues of race and exploration of issues of race. Wherever it went in our journey on our interview with each other, he was able to give me a sense of these little births to self all the way, and I can look back and go, oh, I guess that's who I am.
To get back to what you were saying, what these stories do for people, I did think today, you know, we suffer a lot. We're lonely in our suffering a lot, just as general as people, as humans. You know, we run away from our friends that are suffering because it's uncomfortable or whatever, you know. Not always, but you know what I mean. It's difficult, and so I think that if you can listen to a stranger's story that has a lot to do with your own suffering, it's kind of a way of not feeling quite so alone in that experience.
2 years ago, we started something called the National Day of Listening, where we asked the whole country on the day after Thanksgiving to take an hour out and record a loved one by any means necessary, like whether it's your cell phone or your computer, or you go to a local electronics store with a bunch of neighbors and buy a $60 digital recorder. And the idea is that, you know, sitting down with a loved one for an hour and asking these questions is really one of the least expensive but most meaningful gifts we can give to one another.
We are going to be spending the day after Thanksgiving having people record their stories at the Talking Book and Braille Center. We're really excited to have these stories, whether they're the everyday happenings or war stories or stories that involve the history of our capital city. Anything will be valuable to keep and to archive in libraries, and that's why it's so important to us.
You know, I like to think of us as New Jersey Smithsonian, and I think anytime we're dealing with history, whether it's an oral history or history told through objects, it has a place here at the museum.
And eventually what we hope is that, you know, StoryCorps becomes part of the fabric of American life, and just doing these interviews becomes part of what it means to be an American and part of what it means to live in